Praise the Lord. We're going to read Acts chapter 25, 1 to 12. And the title of this is Paul Appeals to Caesar. Now, when Festus was come into the province after 3 days, he ascended from Caesarea to Jerusalem. Then the high priest and the chief of the Jews informed him against Paul and besought him and desired favor against him that he would send for him to Jerusalem, laying wait in the way to kill him. But Festus answered that Paul should be kept at Caesarea, and that he himself would depart shortly thither. Let them therefore, said he, which among you are able, go down with me and accuse this man, if there be any wickedness in him. And when he had tarried among them more than 10 days, he went down unto Caesarea. And the next day, sitting on the judgment seat, commanded Paul to be brought. And when he was come, the Jews which came down from Jerusalem stood round about, and laid many and grievous complaints against Paul, which they could not prove. While he answered for himself, neither against the law of the Jews, neither against the temple, nor yet against Caesar, have I offended anything at all. But Festus, willing to do the Jews a pleasure, answered Paul and said, Wilt thou go up to Jerusalem and there be judged of these things before me? Then said Paul, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat, where I ought to be judged. To the Jews have I done no wrong, as thou very well knowest. For if I be an offender, or have committed anything worthy of death, I refuse not to die. But if there be none of these things whereof these accuse me, no man may deliver me unto them. I appeal unto Caesar. Then Festus, when he had conferred with the council, answered, Hast thou appealed unto Caesar? Unto Caesar shalt thou go. Again, reading verse number 1, Acts 25, it says, Now when Festus was come into the province after 3 days, he ascended from Caesarea to Jerusalem. Festus, of course, had taken Felix's place as the governor, and only after 3 days he had gone into Caesarea. However, just 3 days later, after he probably inquired about the reason for Paul being there, traveled to Jerusalem to inquire more thoroughly about Paul's circumstances. It seems that Festus only took 3 days to deal with the problem, or at least to get started on the problem. In regard to the level of government that he was in, it would seem that there would be others that would have dealt with Paul. But at that time, it seems to be for the rulers, the governors of those areas, those conquered areas, to rule on cases of criminals or those that are accused of crime. Today, obviously, the governor does not do that, in the United States at least. It does not give any indication of how he had traveled to Jerusalem, but he had prepared probably a carriage along with some Roman soldiers as guardians to make the trip. In verse number 2 it says, Then the high priest and the chief of the Jews informed him against Paul and besought him. Of course, the high priest and chief of the Jews were trying to get Paul killed. That was their ultimate objective. Actually, here it mentions that the high priest and the chief of the Jews were actually involved in the planning of Paul's execution. Then, in speaking of the previous plan of having him murdered, must have been known by them or even inspired by them, for it said that there were 40 Jews who had made a vow and they were not going to eat or drink until they had killed Paul. Thus, you could probably think from these two cases involving the Jews in both cases was probably true. that is, the religious Jews. Was it that the high priest and chief of the Jews involved in getting those 40 together to have them make that vow, or in some way get Paul killed without them being deliberately linked to it? They may have concealed their intention from Festus, but had Festus already known about why Paul had been there, he would have been guilty for taking Paul to Jerusalem, really. That note of the reason for Paul's detention had already been provided, at least to Felix. Had it been still there, and was it part of the trial notes? There would be no hiding it, really, from Festus of why Paul was there and the threat that was posed in Jerusalem. Furthermore, Paul was a Roman citizen, so that, of course, helped Paul greatly in keeping this case under the watchful eye of the Roman government rather than just the Jews and their government or their law. Yet even so, the Jews had sought for Festus to listen to their case against Paul and have them get some favor to have Paul brought to Jerusalem. And the only way that they would have been able to do so was against the better judgment of real justice in the Roman Empire. In verse number 3, it says, and desired favor against him that he would send for him to Jerusalem, laying wait in the way to kill him. This was the plan of the Jews, to get Paul killed. That was their ultimate objective. It wasn't really to have the trial in Jerusalem, it was to kill him before he even got there. If only Festus would listen to their side of the story and have Paul brought to Jerusalem, then they could master their plan to have Paul murdered and without even a trial. Here it even states that they would lie in wait in the way to have Paul killed. The chief priests and those who had taught the law or even had Proverbs within their hand must have read over Proverbs chapter 1, where Solomon, the one who had received wisdom, speak to others about lying in wait for blood. And this is exactly what they were planning to do. Furthermore, here in this story in Acts, it explains it very clearly that the intention of those who were trying to get Paul to Jerusalem were, in fact, planning to lie in wait or have someone do it on their part. Yet Solomon was writing for such cases as this, though it would seem that it would never come from a high priest or those Jews of such level. But it was true that they were willing to do such things to compete with the gospel or to get rid of the message of the gospel, of this Jesus that they had previously gotten rid of because they hated the gospel, they hated Jesus. Here it shows that those who were doing such as planning, lying in wait to murder someone, sinners. And the one who consented was not even a Jew, but it was Festus, a Roman. That is, he did not consent for the Jews to have that trial in Jerusalem because he said no. But then later on, he asked Paul, so it was almost like he was being influenced to some certain degree. Even though that Festus may not have known what they intended along the way, we cannot be for sure, but it looks like he had a pretty good idea, or at least he should have known. Felix could have explained it to him, but Festus did not at first consent to them. Later on, he might have changed his mind a little bit to ask Paul if he wanted to go to Jerusalem. But from Lysias, from Felix, from the letter, from all of that, even the trial beforehand, he should not have even asked Paul, but he did. In Proverbs chapter 1, 10 to 16, it says, My son, if sinners entice thee, consent thou not. If they say, Come with us and let us lay wait for blood, let us lurk privily for the innocent without cause. Let us swallow them up alive as the grave, and whole as those that go down into the pit. We shall find all precious substance. We shall fill our houses with spoil. Cast in thy lot among us. Let us all have one purse. My son, walk not thou in the way with them. Refrain thy foot from their path, for their feet run to evil, and make haste to shed blood. So, verse 4. But Festus answered that Paul should be kept at Caesarea, and that he himself would depart shortly thither. So, in the first case, before the trial that they were going to have in Caesarea, he decided not to have Paul come to Jerusalem. He decided instead for them to go to Caesarea. So that is kind of like Festus was the one who was more or less listening to Solomon's advice, whereas the Jews, the chief Jew, and also the high priest and those that were highly quote unquote religious people, even though that they might have read Proverbs 1, surely they must have, they still planned a murder. Even against their own law, they were doing it. They were doing it against their own laws. Paul wasn't violating their laws, and Paul knew it, and they probably knew it, but they were willing to go that far to basically trample on Moses' law just to get rid of Paul. Therefore, Festus did not give in to their ways. Surely the Jews were pleading with a new governor, Festus, and they might have thought that they would have a chance to get Paul and have him brought to Jerusalem under that new governor. But Festus answered quite quickly, without considering it too much, that Paul would not be coming to Jerusalem, but that he would be kept at Caesarea. Maybe he had just come to get some details about the case from them in order to help him form a more logical decision making that he might have done. Let us um, the give him the something of the doubt. The put him as a in a positive light rather than a negative light, because obviously the Jews were thinking negatively, but he was not quite convinced or even being convinced to go the route of uh, doing something evil. Verse 5, Let them therefore, said he, which among you are able, go down with me and accuse this man, if there be any wickedness in him. What it does seem, though, that Festus is giving the Jews the run around concerning Paul. Festus wanted another trial for Paul to be held, not in Jerusalem, but in Caesarea, where Festus had been staying. And basically, that is where Paul was being held. Yet, to help the Jews that were against Paul, Festus invites them to come with him to have the trial once they arrive in Caesarea. That to the Jews probably did sound like inviting and possibly a way to get their quote unquote justice done, but it was not as good as they wished. They still noted that Festus was following real justice and not putting justice in the hands of those who wished Paul killed. It is even stated by Festus that he did not know if there was any wickedness in him. In verse number 6 it states, And when he had tarried among them more than 10 days, he went down unto Caesarea, and the next day, sitting on the judgment seat, commanded Paul to be brought. As it states, Festus was there in Jerusalem for more than 10 days. He may have had other things that he could have done, and he could have found out the majority of the details concerning the case. But why he wanted a trial was probably for legal reasons. Thus, Festus had invited those accusers of Paul to come to Caesarea to deal with the problem, for Festus had to deal with that person in custody, who was Paul. Thus, for Festus, basically, there was no waiting around. It was as though the Jews could not prepare their case any further unless they were able to get it ready within that 10 days. But they must have been ready, for they had prepared everything beforehand for Felix. But according to Festus's plans, it was really quite speedily done. And that was interesting to say the least, that Festus had caused them to come along with him and have everything prepared, quote unquote, so quickly. It was not according to the Jews' timetable, but it was according to Festus's timetable and liking. That seemed for Festus a little towards his pleasure, but he needed, though, to take care of Paul. For Festus had actually kept him waiting for 2 years without any result as of yet. Thus he may have felt it as an obligation, but also he was probably just as curious as Festus had been when he had heard the account. It is, though, for us curious whether the report from Felix had been left or it was just by word of mouth. It would seem that Felix would have left the letter from Lysias and other report of the trial, the court trial that they had previously, and that would have given Festus enough information. That should have been done according to the law, I suppose, but we can only guess unless history records it, and if they really did keep records like they do so today. Now only the Jews were called, his accusers, to the court trial, but also Paul, after he had been brought before Festus and the accusers were there. He was ready because, of course, the Holy Spirit was leading him. Verse number 7, and when he was come, the Jews which came down from Jerusalem stood round about and laid many and grievous complaints against Paul, which they could not prove. So here Luke points out the fact that even though that they had come again for trial, they had laid out many things that they had said, but they could not prove them. The crowd of Jews had come, those that were his accusers, but it seems that they had not had a good case against Paul. For it states that they had laid their case against him, but they could not prove anything against him. Thus, with Felix and then, in this portion, Festus, who had also heard out the case, nothing was an advantage towards the Jews. Basically, Paul was there just wasting time, can we say? But actually, he was writing letters or doing something else towards the kingdom, even though that he may have been, you know, in custody and not able to leave. Only that they could somehow get Festus to override the law and let them deal with Paul. In other words, it would have to have been some type of corruption to get Paul out of there. But through quote unquote justice, it should not have been that Paul would be given over to the Jews. Felix did not condemn Paul, and now we're looking at the decision of Festus. Verse 8 says, while he answered for himself, and that is Paul, here it starts Paul's speech. Neither against the law of the Jews, neither against the temple, nor yet against Caesar have I offended anything at all. Here it seems just like a one sentence answer. Maybe, of course, there was a lot more added to that, but Paul did not seem to talk openly, at least in this sentence, about Jesus, because that would have riled the Jews. But he did say, that he wasn't offending the law, nor really Caesar. So that it would present a good case that, wouldn't make the Jews go crazy. Paul had stated it clearly, but for the Jews, obviously, their ideas were that anything preached that was of Jesus Christ was an offense to them. Nevertheless, for Paul, it was not contrary to the law. Therefore, when Paul had answered, he had answered for himself instead of having anyone represent him. He had known the law just as much as the chief priests. But of course, they had disagreed with him only about Jesus in that he had resurrected from the dead, just simply because they did not believe in Jesus. Thus, Paul had said he had done nothing against the law of the Jews, nor anything against the temple, nor against Caesar had he offended. It was that the Jews previously had stated that Jesus, because he was a king, he was an offense against Caesar. But with Paul, they had nothing, really nothing to go on. Just Festus's desire, possibly, to side with them is the only thing that the Jews could get, if they were able. But that, in itself, would be corruption. Verse number 9 says, But Festus, willing to do the Jews a pleasure, answered Paul, and said, Wilt thou go up to Jerusalem and there be judged of these things before me? Why? The question is, Festus, you are there in quote unquote Caesar's seat. You are the judge there. You're hearing the case already. You already have everybody available. And why would he even say go to Jerusalem? They came from Jerusalem there to Caesarea. Why go back to Jerusalem? What's the purpose of that? Festus did not want to do the ordering of Paul to go to Jerusalem to be tried. That is certain. There is instead a question. They were already in Caesarea, so the question would be, why can they not finish the trial there, get it over with in Caesarea? Why is it that they are continuing to argue it out? Festus has not completely decided on the case. What's the holdup? Again, nothing substantial has been laid down for Paul to be sentenced. That was already twice that he had been to trial with two different governors and no final answer. Why would he even have to go to Jerusalem? And if he went to Jerusalem, he wouldn't even make it there because the Jews were planning to kill him along the way anyway. Was it only that that is where he had committed, quote unquote, the offense, but they had already had representation there in Caesarea? Festus, as it states, was only willing to do the Jews a pleasure. But Festus may not have known about their plans, but they did. But Festus should have known. It would have saved Festus's neck, actually, for Paul not to go to Jerusalem. And, of course, it would have caused Paul's death, too. He must have heard about the letter. That is Felix. But there is a possibility that he may not have. Of course, it's up in the air. In verse number 10, it says, Then said Paul, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat, where I ought to be judged. To the Jews have I done nothing wrong. Have I done no wrong, as thou very well knowest. Paul, though, kind of rebukes Festus, as having known that he should be judged at Caesar's judgment seat, where he was at Caesarea, the reason why the city is named after Caesar. However, what also sounds fishy is that Festus asked Paul to be judged at Jerusalem, where he himself would judge him. But that would not be Caesar's judgment seat. Paul recognized that and said that he had done no wrong against the Jews, and said it to Festus that he had known that Paul had not done anything wrong against them, for the sake of only doing the Jews a pleasure, that is, trying to please the Jews and not really following the law. Festus had asked that question, but Paul had already known what the plans of the Jews were. But he was not going to say anything to anyone about what he had known. Instead, he steered the trial away from Jerusalem and followed basically what Jesus had said he would do, testify before Caesar. So he would appeal to him in order to get that opportunity, for Jesus had said he would be able to testify to Caesar. In verse number 11, it says, "For if I be an offender or have committed anything worthy of death, I refuse not to die. But if there be none of these things whereof these accuse me, no man may deliver me unto them. I appeal unto Caesar." It's like putting Paul into their hands. What is going to happen? It's not going to be justice. It's going to be death, yes, but not justice. Actually, it sounds like Paul knew exactly what the plan was. That Paul would be, if Paul was delivered unto the Jews instead of the Romans in Jerusalem, he would be killed, possibly killed along the way. He understood that. But he also understood that he would not be in the hands of the Romans in Jerusalem. He would be put into the hands of the Jews, even though that Festus said, "Would you like to go to Jerusalem and be judged by me?" He was basically saying that he would be judged by Festus, but it sounds more like he would be judged by the Jews. Therefore, Paul did not accept that, and even though Festus had said that Paul would be judged of him in Jerusalem, it sounds more like deceit, so to speak. So they probably all had known what would have happened had Paul been taken to Jerusalem. Furthermore, Paul pushes the issue of the fact that if he had committed anything worthy of death, he would not even refuse to die. But he had not done so. Moreover, there was nothing that the Jews could prove in their accusations. So then, Paul should not be delivered up to the Jews, because it was his choice, though Festus did not give him the choice to be tried in Rome. Paul appealed to Caesar anyhow, as if he knew what he could do in that case. For Jesus to have told him that he would testify in Rome, that actually had given Paul the answer of what he should say in regard to Festus and that trial that he was having, being presented with a question from Festus. It came as a way to deceive Paul, but Paul knew otherwise, and Jesus' word was clear, to the point in the answer to the question from Festus. In other words, Paul should not have said anything as to go to Jerusalem, but he did right in appealing to Caesar. In verse number 12, it says, "Then Festus, when he had conferred with the council, answered, Hast thou appealed unto Caesar? Unto Caesar thou shalt go." Festus was a person, it seems, who had made up his mind quickly. Of course, he did confer with the council, but he was determined to allow Paul to go before Caesar. The Jews did not totally convince him, but he was willing to see what Paul would say about going to Jerusalem. Though Festus did not want to make that decision because it may have gotten him into deep trouble. However, even if Paul had made the decision to go to Jerusalem and if he was murdered, it would definitely have caused much trouble for Festus, it can be assured. However, Paul had known what Jesus had told him, so he knew that he would be going to Rome. So the way to do so was to appeal to Caesar, and that would definitely bring him out of the power of the Jews in Jerusalem and totally under the hand of Caesar. Because Paul had appealed unto Caesar, even though he was being judged in Caesarea, where it was part of the Roman government to judge, and because his case had still not been decided on fully, Paul going to Rome would put him out of the reach of the Jews, but not out of the reach of a Roman emperor, who later, as the emperors changed, were against Christianity or even against the Jews. They had changed, but at the time it was fine. He would face a Roman emperor that was not quite the same as Nero, but when Nero got into power, then Paul was faced with capital punishment. But then again, one could say, and so Jerusalem fell later on in 70 AD anyway. So, and that is it. May God bless you today. In Jesus' name.